Good morning and welcome to the 87th Landon Lecture on Public Issues. We are very privileged to have as our speaker this morning United States Senator Bill Bradley. Before I introduce our speaker, let me introduce the other members of the platform party. On my left, Dr. William Hensinger, Professor of Economics and President of the Kansas State University Faculty Senate. Next to him, Todd Heitschmidt, a graduate student in agricultural economics and the president of the K-State student body. On my right, Dr. Charles Reagan, chairman of the Landon Lecture Series and my executive assistant. Senator Bradley is currently serving in his third term of the United States Senate as the senior senator from the state of New Jersey. As a member of Congress, he serves as a strong champion for children and a clean environment. Senator Bradley also served as the prime architect, as you probably remember, of the 1986 historic tax reform code. He's regarded by many political pundits as a future presidential candidate and as a rising star in the United States Senate and in the National Democratic Party. Prior to joining the Senate, he played professional basketball for 10 years with the New York Knicks, helping them win, if you can believe this, 2 world championships. He attended Oxford University as a Rhodes Scholar and earned a graduate degree after studying politics, philosophy, and economics. As an undergraduate, he attended Princeton University. He was a 3-time All-American basketball player while at Princeton and graduated with honors. Senator Bradley also served as captain of the gold medal-winning United States basketball team at the 1964 Olympics. As I said, Senator Bradley was a Rhodes Scholar. Well, I just want everybody here today to know, and especially Senator Bradley, that in the past 5 years, K-State has produced 5 Rhodes Scholars, 8 Truman Scholars, 2 Marshall Scholars, 3 Mellon Scholars, 5 Phi Kappa Phi Scholars, and 12 Fulbright Scholars. As most everybody here knows, just last week we learned that K-State's debate team won the national championship in debate over UCLA. When you put that all together, I think we can make the case that Kansas State University has become, over the past 5 years, the student scholar capital of America for public universities. Senator Bradley, I wish you would invite our debate team to the United States Senate and allow us to remind America that academic excellence still exists in the American heartland. Please welcome the United States Senator Bill Bradley, the senior senator from the state of New Jersey.
President Weefall, President Heitschmidt, it's the way I begin all my speeches. The audience has to think this is going to be an explosion or a speech. But but I am very pleased to be here today and participate in this distinguished lecture series honoring Alfred M. Landon. In addition to being a statesman and a governor, he was the father of Kansas' gift to the U.S. Senate, Nancy Landon Kassenbaum. And as one of her colleagues, I'd like to thank him and you for giving her the opportunity to serve, which she does with distinction. This morning, I'm reminded of the words of Emporia's great editor, William Allen White, who described Kansas as hardly a state, but a kind of prophecy. Now, what he had in mind when he said those words was the fierce battle over slavery here that presaged the Civil War, the early blooming of populism with the slogan that farmers should raise less corn and more hell, and the early establishment in Kansas of women's suffrage and stricter worker safety laws. But so given White's comment, I think the Landon Lecture here at Kansas State is an appropriate place to examine the new circumstances America faces in the world. So what can we say about this new emerging world? First, we no longer stand unchallenged economically, nor only opposite the Soviet Union. We spent a lot of our economic productivity during the Cold War on ensuring ourselves against a military threat from a country whose economic and social foundations were full of termites. Then, just at the time Mikhail Gorbachev and George Bush and spy novelist John le Carré declared that the Cold War was over, just at the time Germany reunites and 100,000 Soviet citizens were permitted to leave, just at the time when we felt we were turning a page in history, Saddam Hussein invades Kuwait. Was his action the beginning of a new kind of conflict or the end of the old? And was our response the beginning of a new world order or the culmination of an old order? From the standpoint of Wilsonian vision for collective security, the war to free Kuwait ranks with World War II and the containment of Soviet expansion in terms of its success. Its message is loud and clear. A dictator who invades another country risks the collective condemnation of the nations of the world and the quick destruction of his army. Yet it may also signal the dawning of an age when even the most skilled collective security cannot prevent the violence that lies ahead. For even though the nations of the Middle East have, for now, escape the threat of Saddam Hussein and have an opportunity, however fleeting and unlikely, to forge a lasting peace among themselves. Even though the nations of Eastern and Western Europe are now largely free from any external threats to their territory or right to exist, even though the prospects of armed conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union have faded in less than 10 years from ominously inevitable to nearly impossible, even though all this is true, the world is not at peace. The violence we see reported in South Africa, in Northern Ireland, in Kashmir, in the Balkans, and in the Caucasus is a precursor of the kinds of conflict we'll face increasingly in the world. The Cold War froze everything into a bipolar world. Its thaw opens the cracks and crevices of old societies and unfortunately releases the toxins of ethnic, racial, and religious hatreds. For example, in the territory of Iraq, the conflicts between Shiite and Sunni Muslims, between ethnic Kurds and Arabs, began long before Saddam Hussein came to power and will continue long after his demise. In Yugoslavia, the failure of communism unleashed half a century's worth of conflict among Slovenians and Croatians and Serbs. The future shape of Russia and the Soviet Empire hinges on unresolved disputes between Azerbaijani Muslims and Armenian Christians, between Georgians and Ossetians and Abkhazians and Kyrgyz and Uzbeks and many other distant neighbors. And although the United States has a role to play, these ethnic, racial, and religious conflicts don't lend themselves to activist American peacemaking on the Wilsonian model. International law provides the basis for action when one country invades another country. It does not answer the question of whether the Kurds or the Palestinians or the Croatians deserve a homeland or where the land should come from. The principle of self-determination for a nation can't tell us whether in Soviet Georgia school children should be required to speak Russian, or whether in Romania school books can be printed in the language of the Hungarian minority. Our military force can rarely end job discrimination, religious fanaticism, and hateful attitudes and stereotypes. For newly freed peoples seeking ways to live together peacefully in Central and Eastern Europe and Africa, within the borders of what is still the Soviet Union and elsewhere, American leadership depends more on the example of the kind of society we build than on our military might. And the most powerful example is that of a pluralistic society whose democracy and growing economy takes all its citizens to the higher ground. But we can't lead by example as long as white Americans build mental walls between themselves and the abysmal living conditions of many black Americans in our cities. We can't lead by example if we allow gangs to turn city neighborhoods into war zones and schools into fortresses so that the 10% of the kids who don't want to learn can destroy the possibility of learning for the 90% who do want to learn. We can't lead by example if individuals refuse to take responsibility for their own actions, or government bureaucrats remain unaccountable for results. We can't lead by example if it's easier to put a man on the moon than to get a low-income pregnant woman across town to a doctor. We can't lead by example if we fail to see that crime often causes poverty and destroys the interracial bonds of a civil society. So in facing up to the realities of race and ethnicity in America, we also have to observe that the isolation of urban black poverty developed in part from our failure to respond to an economic migration of 5 million people. African Americans moving from the sharecropping farms of the South to the cities of the North. Indeed, racial, ethnic, and religious conflict is sometimes inseparable from the conflict of economic migration. Open borders in Eastern Europe unleash fears for the people of ethnically homogenous countries in Western Europe. Riots in Marseille, violence in London, xenophobia in Germany come from fears of actual and potential migrations from Asia, North Africa, Poland, Soviet Union. Let's face it, when large groups of people move from one place to another, things happen. And you know, one of the most dramatic economic migrations in the world is occurring today along the 2,000-mile border between the United States and Mexico. That border is more than the only frontier between the industrialized and developing worlds, although it is the only frontier. As Carlos Fuentes has said, that border is also the gulf between 15th century Spain and 18th century England. It separates our cultures as well as our economies. That's true. But it's the comparative economic opportunity in the United States that increasingly will pull Mexico's best people north, leaving Mexico with the unskilled and America with a massive social problem. And that's why understanding the dynamics of economic migration will allow us to control it, to forestall its most disruptive economic effects, and to lessen the ethnic, racial, and religious tensions that could follow. Earlier this month, I visited Nuevo León. It's a prosperous state in northern Mexico, not far from Laredo, Texas. During a visit, I met with one of the candidates running for governor. He told me about a small town in northern Nuevo León called De Cross, with a population of 6,000 people. 4,000 women, 2,000 males. The men are largely boys or old men. Almost all the young and middle-aged men have gone to the United States. The men of De Cross didn't want to break up their families, to leave their parents and wives and children behind. Like anyone, they would have preferred to remain in the town where they grew up, to be with their families, to be citizens of a stable, productive community. But there were no jobs. Prevented by trade barriers from developing businesses that could trade freely with U.S. consumers and industry, they had little chance of getting ahead. In fact, they found themselves as isolated from opportunity as black sharecroppers in the American South in the 1940s. Well, why has this happened? For many years, Mexican policies were responsible for as much as our own, for the poverty and isolation of towns like De Cross. It was Mexican policies that created and protected corrupt state industries. It was the federal bureaucracy in Mexico City whose policies precipitated a disastrous internal Mexican migration to the capital city. It was Mexican policies that allowed nearly 20 million people to live in Mexico City choking on air pollution. It was Mexican policies that tried to keep Mexico an anti-American island in a sea of good faith attempts to bridge our differences. Those were Mexican policies. But since Carlos Salinas, the new president of Mexico, a Harvard-educated economist, took office 2 years ago, the economic and political changes in Mexico have been as profound as any in the globe. Last August, Salinas proposed the most significant step for his country's future, which is a free trade agreement with the United States. In February, President Bush and Prime Minister Mulroney of Canada joined Salinas to begin negotiations on a North American free trade zone. And you know, there's only one thing you really need to know about Mexico to understand why the free trade agreement is so critical to Salinas and to us. Half the population of Mexico's 80 million people are under the age of 15. Half the population of Mexico's 80 million people are under the age of 15. Beginning right now, either jobs will be created below the Rio Grande in places like De Cross, or there will be more and more legal and illegal immigration into Texas and California, Oklahoma, Kansas, and even to New Jersey and New York and Florida. And that economic migration will dwarf the migration of black Americans to the north. So what do? Well, I believe Congress should support the administration in making a maximum effort to complete successfully the negotiations for a free trade area. It won't be easy. There are legitimate problems. But a good free trade agreement would be of great benefit to the United States. It could add dynamism to our economy, creating thousands of jobs and making us more competitive in world markets. It could transform our southern border and enrich our national culture. You know, clearly there will be thoughtful and constructive opposition to this view. Such a major development in our economic life deserves such thorough debate. But if we view the proposed free trade agreement as one inseparable component in an overall reform in Mexico I personally can't see any strong argument for not even attempting to get an agreement. The fact is, we don't always see Mexico as its people would want us to see them. Opponents of the Free Trade Pact see Mexico's politics as hopelessly corrupt and undemocratic. Yet Salinas appears to be using his political legitimacy rather than police power to bring about reform. Opponents of the Free Trade Pact still see Mexico as a country happily lax in its environmental regulation. Yet the mayor of Mexico City told me he's spending nearly $3.5 billion over the next 4 years to try to clean up the air of Mexico City. Opponents of the Free Trade Pact still see Mexico as a stubbornly inefficient, politically stagnant nation unwilling to give up the temporary benefits of inflation, budget deficits, and government ownership of key economic industries. But President Salinas has already cut his country's budget deficit by the equivalent of 3 Grand Rudmans. He has already dramatically brought inflation down, reduced tariffs, encouraged foreign investment, and privatized many state enterprises, such as telephones. Opponents of the Free Trade Pact see Mexico as inward-looking, and yet Mexico now turns outward, ready to tear down the last frontier between the developing and industrial world, ready to try to become a first world nation. The negotiations over the Free Trade Pact with Mexico will be a test of whether Americans and Mexicans can overcome their stereotypes and suspicions of each other in pursuit of a larger goal, a more productive economy on both sides of the border. Can we be bold enough, imaginative enough to create the conditions that will enhance our children's future? Do we have the courage to face the fact that their chance, our children's chance for a better life depends on raising our own productivity, which in turn depends on improving our quality at home and finding common ground abroad? A Mexican journalist told me once that what his country needed was a market economy without a capitalist society. Achieving the inefficiencies of the market without the excesses and exploitation of a non-competitive, state-protected capitalist culture. Well, I tend to agree, because real change can only take place in the context of a democratic society that is open both internally to ideas and movement and externally to the dynamic economies of a growing world. Mexico is leading Latin America toward that possibility. It is a transition perhaps not quite as dramatic as the swing from Warsaw Pact communism to Western capitalism, but almost as difficult, because the old system was not unnaturally imposed on Mexico. They chose it, and now they have to change it. Mexican reform will be a model for Brazil, and we should not be so complacent to think that it can offer implications for the United States, for Japan, and even for other developed nations. Mexican reform efforts remind us of some things. Get us back to thinking about the basics. America must stand for the efficiency of the market system without the excesses and unfairness of a non-competitive capitalist system. Wealth should not be guaranteed by government contracts, licenses, or subsidies. It should be earned by performance in the real world. Economies should be open to worldwide trade, investment, and competition, because that delivers the lowest prices and the highest quality to the greatest number of people. It also engenders pride and confidence in those who work for the world-class companies that can compete. Those countries that balk at opening up should be penalized by the rest of the world for depriving their own citizens of a higher living standard and for imposing their own responsibility on the international system. Tax systems should be progressive. If you have more, creates wealth and ignores human needs is doomed in the long run. The fundamental challenge for a democratic society is adapting to change, facilitating and assisting individual citizens in their quest to find tomorrow's opportunities and adjust to yesterday's losses. For America to remain the land of opportunity, economic policy must be human-centered, political leaders must level with the people, and the promise of our pluralism must be fulfilled. To the extent that we achieve this ambitious and imaginative goal within the emerging North American free trade area, America will be able to lead the world by example, be able to lead a complex and shifting world of races, religions, and ethnicities, and of ambitious individuals searching for economic opportunity. If we can bring to our interactions in the world the highest values that we aspire to in our dealings with each other, America can remain a beacon to the diverse peoples everywhere. America can be a pluralistic society whose democracy and economy takes all of its citizens to the higher ground. Thank you very much.
I can barely see over this thing. Anyway, we have some time for questions. So if you do have a question, if you would step to your left or right, and please address the question.
Let me just, while we're waiting for the questions to appear, I just want you to see how the President would have delivered this speech. I just want to... I just want to tell you how I like to do questions. Whoever asks the question, asks the question. If I don't know the answer to the question or I think it's stupid, I'm going to go like this and I'll call it. Is there one over here? Yes.
Senator, in your discussion, you built a scenario that opposition to free trade with Mexico is based on certain stereotypes regarding the government or the people of Mexico. Possibly the most important point of opposition is concern that at a time when the gap between the rich and the poor in this country is increasing, at a time when we not only have unemployed poor, but working poor in this country, at a time when multinational corporations are getting away with things which 20 years ago might have been considered illegal, you're not considering the opposition that involves companies moving to Mexico, taking advantage of this free trade, and leaving our workers in a worse situation, workers not only in Kansas but in your own state of New Jersey. I don't disagree with your intent or looking to the future to open free trade, but in making that move, could you outline some protection for American workers and American families in making that transition?
Sure, I think that those are legitimate concerns, and I think that they clearly have answers. The fact of the matter is that one of the concerns is that we will lose jobs in the United States and they will go to Mexico. There have been about 4 studies done on what the impact will be on jobs in the United States. All 4 of them say that there will be a net increase in jobs. The most optimistic is done by a noted international economist, Rudy Dornbush, who points out that we might lose, as a result of the free trade area, about 35,000 jobs in the United States, but we will gain about 140,000 jobs. So that net, we will have an increase in the number of jobs created in the United States. Why is that so? Well, Mexicans buy about 70% of all their exports, all of their imports, from the United States. So as the economies of the 2 countries begin to grow, Mexican purchase of U.S. imports will dramatically increase, and that will mean more jobs in the United States. And that's particularly the case in the regions of the country that sell large amounts of agricultural products because Mexico will be a major market for our products.
Could you give a time frame on that?
Uh,
I mean, what are the projections for?
This man sounds like a political scientist. The time frame on it, one of the keys of the negotiation. Right now we're at the beginning of this process. Should we extend so-called fast-track negotiating authority to the Mexico free trade negotiations? What does that mean? That means that Congress votes up and down, yes or no, on whatever agreement is negotiated by the administration with Mexico. I believe we should provide fast-track authority. As I said in my speech, there are many difficult problems in a negotiation toward a free trade area between Mexico and the United States. And one doesn't know for certain that you will conclude that negotiation successfully, but we should try to conclude it successfully. And one of the key areas of negotiation is the one that you've alluded to, which is the transition period. Since about 10% of Americans change their jobs every year, a reasonable transition period for different things in different sectors of the economy will be close to 10 years, probably. My guess is you're looking at 10 to 13 years before you would have fully effected a free trade agreement. But what you will have done in the meantime is to set a direction, lock Mexico into reform, begin to put pressure by virtue of having a more open market on improvement in both the political and environmental and judicial institutions of Mexico. The result will be benefit for the United States, both in the creation of jobs, a more stable society on our southern border, and a cleaner environment in both countries. Yes?
Senator, what are your thoughts?
I can hear you.
Okay. What are your thoughts on the national child care situation?
Well, my thoughts on the national child care situation is that we have a lot of work to do to improve the quality of child care. I mean, child care problems result from a lot of facts, changed facts in some circumstances, economic pressures that have driven many mothers or fathers out of the home into the workplace so that you have two-parent families now, with the need for child care not being fulfilled as it has been in many previous generations by other members of the family, though still the dominant child care outside the home is provided by a relative of the family, but still there is enormous need for additional child care assistance. Last year we passed a major child care bill which we hope will help. It is not enough. And frankly, I think one of the things I was referring to in the talk when I said individuals have to begin to take responsibility for themselves, that means everything from making sure that parents support their children. If you're under a court order to support your child, you shouldn't skip out of town and be able to escape the requirement that you support your child. On one extreme. On the other extreme, it means all of us recognizing that the most important thing that we have to give to children is our time, and that some things have to be sacrificed if what we're really interested in is assuring a next generation as healthy, productive citizens who have a stake and have a set of values. So there are governmental answers to this problem that help, but there are answers that primarily come from individuals making decisions about their own lives and how they care for their children.
Senator, do you see any particular problems in the liberalization of agricultural trade? And second, how could liberalization of agricultural trade help the agricultural development of Mexico?
Well, I'm going to leave that for the President of Mexico to decide that. Agriculture will be one of the negotiations. The nature of agriculture in Mexico is much different than in the United States. When Mexico enters into a free trade agreement, it is essentially saying that it is willing ultimately to import much greater quantities of agricultural goods from the United States, where we produce with such great efficiency, wheat being a prime example of that. On the other hand, there are certain crops in Mexico where Mexico will export to the United States. And I think of certain citrus products, certain types of fruits and vegetables could very well be a comparative advantage in Mexico. So I look at it as a chance for the United States to export agricultural goods to Mexico in greater quantities than we have. And I think that part of Mexico's adjustment is going to have to be to realize that certain elements of its agriculture is they're just not competitive. The President seems to recognize that, and I'm sure that there will be adjustment measures planned for the agricultural sector in Mexico.
Senator Bradley, many of the contemporary economists who explore the area of free trade tend to comment on the effects between two nations that are economically relatively close. However, colonial economist Adam Smith and 19th century French economist Frédéric Bastiat explored the possibilities of benefits of free trade between two more economically distant nations in terms of standard of living and health of the economy in general. Now, assuming that a free trade agreement between the United States and Mexico works out, do you see this expanding to include some of the even lesser developed nations of Latin America?
I would like to have successfully concluded a negotiation with Mexico and get into it for a few years to gain some certainty that it's workable and confidence in the mechanisms before we would expand a free trade area further south. Now, with that said, let me put all of my cards on the table. I think by far the best kind of trade agreement is a multilateral trade agreement, where all the nations of the world agree to changes reducing trade barriers and tariffs and non-tariff barriers. And we are in the process now of the so-called Uruguay round negotiations. Those would reduce barriers worldwide, and that, in my view, is an even more important negotiation than the U.S.-Mexico negotiation. I chose today to talk about U.S. and Mexico for a variety of obvious reasons, but the Uruguay round, in my view, is a much more important negotiation for all of our benefit.
Senator, I have two questions for you. One deals with the environment and another deals with the poverty and the, as you said, en Nuevo Laredo, the people coming across the border because of lack of jobs. You said 4,000 are women, 2,000 are men, and most of them are under the, or 15 or under, or old men. You say that they come across the border because there's a lack of jobs, and if the American companies went down there, it would create the jobs. At least that's the general impression I got from that. But I was recently down on the Texas-Mexico border and saw a different situation in which the people that are coming across aren't necessarily the most skilled, the best laborers, but ones that can't afford to live on the wages that are given to them by the American companies that are already down there, doing what is my second question, breaking a lot of the laws.
What was your first one?
Okay, coming back to it, in the wages there are very low, like $5 to $7 a day. And do you believe that by having more American companies go down there, that would give them a better standard of living and increase their whole standard of living?
I think I get what you mean.
And also, when they're down there, a lot of the American companies and others are breaking a lot of the environmental laws that are in place in Mexico. They're not enforced very much. In these U.S. trade agreements for free trade, do you also propose standards of environmental protection that are lacking?
Okay, I think that you raised a number of very important and interesting points. The wages in Mexico are lower than the wages in the United States. If you were talking to a Mexican, he wouldn't say American businesses located in Mexico. He'd be saying Mexican businesses with the opportunity to export to the United States would be creating jobs in Mexico. But we shouldn't, you also, if you talk to a Mexican, he would say, look, I don't believe that Mexico should be the permanent low-wage economy. Wages in Mexico will increase if there is an integration of our economies. And that is as it should be. And we will end up with more jobs, Mexicans will end up with more jobs and higher wages. And that is, I think, a positive development. On the environmental front, I think there should be a parallel negotiation, not as a part of the free trade agreement, but a parallel negotiation on the environment. On some levels, Mexican law is stronger than our law. For example, under Mexican law, the federal government can close a factory overnight if it is polluting. It closed the largest refinery in Mexico City just 3 weeks ago. It closed 14 defense industries in Mexico City overnight. Our government doesn't have that authority under the environmental laws. There are 1,800 so-called maquiladora factories along the border that have developed in the last 10 years. You probably referred to those. About 1,000 of those pollute. As a part of a side negotiations, I believe that the Mexicans should say when they're going to have cleaned up these 1,000 and be prepared, if they fail to meet that date, to close those factories so that we end up with a cleaner environment. Now, the Mexican law in 1988 changed. They put a much tougher set of laws on the book. So for new investment in Mexico, it will have to meet the much higher environmental standards. So the problem is, how do you take care of the damage in the past? And my answer is a timetable with specific requirements and a commitment to close if those requirements aren't met. The last point is, particularly on the environmental issue, I mean, acid rain doesn't recognize national boundaries. Oceans don't stop at the border. Rivers that divide two nations are shared by both nations. Aquifers are sometimes under both one country and another, which means if your interest is the environmental quality of your country, which necessarily in an interdependent and increasingly interdependent world means the economic quality of your neighbors as well, and even those far away, then this is one way to begin to keep the pressure on for dramatically improving environmental performance in Mexico and thereby ensuring a cleaner environment in the United States. This is a very speech-centered set of questions. I'm prepared to do this, but let me loosen it up a little bit and say, you should be free to ask me questions about anything you'd like. I assume that's okay with Congressman Slatter. He told me, is that okay with you, Congressman? And if I can't answer any of the questions you ask me, I'll just ask him to.
Given that comment, this question hopefully will be timely. I'd like to change the subject from Adam Smith economics and acid rain to that of athletics. Given your history with college basketball and Kansas State University's administration's bullishness on both academics and athletics, I'd like to get your comments on the current situation in college athletics and specifically the role, if any, that you see government taking in mandating policies which affect college athletics.
Okay. There's some pretty touchy political issues, but I don't know many more touchier than the question that was just asked. But when I went into politics, I basically said, I closed a chapter of sports and athletics, and I was going to move into taxes and trade, and I wasn't going to really get involved in governmental policy on sports. About 2 years ago, a congressman, a friend of mine from New York and from Maryland, we started talking about the issue of, well, how many kids actually who receive an athletic scholarship actually graduate from college? And we had no information. There was no source we could go to that told us that answer. And so we introduced a piece of legislation that said that colleges who provide athletic scholarships to students have to report how many, what percent of those students graduate within a 5-year period. Well, you would have thought, I mean, you know, I'm dealing with taxes, Soviet Union, international trade. I mean, I thought that this was kind of a pretty obvious little simple thing. We just want to know graduation rates. You would have thought that I had exploded a nuclear device. I mean, the NCAA and all of the other groups were all in my office screaming and yelling. I didn't know what I was doing. I said, wait a minute. All I want to know is if you go to college, if you are a college recruiter and you go into the home of a high school student who happens to be a punter or a shooter or a runner or whatever, and you're trying to tell that family, we want that student to come to our school, shouldn't the student's parents be able to ask you, well, of all of the athletes who did come to your school in the last decade, how many actually graduated? In other words, are you interested in my son or daughter as a person, or are you interested in them as a product, essentially? And so we introduced this bill, pushed it, and lo and behold, the NCAA adopted in its own bylaws the decision that it would publish graduation rates. And that was my only encounter since I've been in the Senate with athletic policy making. I hope it's my last. No. But you asked to comment more reflectively on what is about college sports. Well, I have always believed that a university is for the purpose of an education, and that the athletic program at a university should supplement that education. There are times when universities lose sight of that basic fact, and I think that's unfortunate. There's no question that sports bring a lot to a community. They give a sense of unity, a sense of excitement, a sense of commitment, a sense of enjoyment. At the same time, they are, in a fundamental sense, not central to what the university is constituted to do. So in my view, as long as you enjoy sports, fine. But when sports in college become more business than enjoyment, or more bottom line than a quest for excellence, then I think you have a problem.
May I ask a follow-up?
I have some good friends in Boise, so I understand your love of sports. Now, this is going away
Well,
from
let me just pause on that note. He said he had some good friends in New Jersey, and he didn't try to speak with the accent. Let me say that I grew up in a small town, about 3,492 people on the banks of the Mississippi River. And when I went to college, was constantly ridiculed by how I pronounced ORs, as in barn again. And so I had to adjust my mouth so I could say warn again, as opposed to barn again. And I really made that effort, and I think I've succeeded. And if you want to know in New Jersey how you pronounce B-A-L-L, it is ball. If you want to know in Missouri how you pronounce C-O-R-N, it is carn. And I've decided that between ball and carn, I'm trouble on too many levels, and therefore will refrain from even thinking about it and just be natural.
Anyway.
colleague business executives around the United States, an effort aimed at thwarting an agreement between the business community and civil rights leaders with some kind of proposal to take place in the civil rights legislation vetoed by the president. Have you heard anything about that? Do you have any comments on that?
No, I have heard nothing about that. I would hope that it would be the opposite story, that you would have an administration working with business leaders and the civil rights community and to get it an agreement, not to divide, but to bring together. It seems to me that would be a more appropriate role for national leadership.
Senator, in your speech, you didn't fully develop the thought, but you indicated that the United States probably should not be involved in the Kurdish rebellion against Saddam Hussein. So, many national Democrats seem to disagree. Are you at odds with other members of your party on that point?
Well, at no point was this speech intended to be a comment on events in Kurdistan. So let me say, your question takes me a little bit aback because I didn't intend any sentence to imply anything about the Kurdish problem. Now, but let me answer your question. Just assume that it wasn't part of it. Assume you asked me that question directly as opposed to taking it from the speech and making me feel I didn't quite make myself as clear as I wanted to make. I think that the president set very narrow objectives when he deployed force to the region and when he used force in the region. And those narrow objectives were to get the Iraqis out of Kuwait. His objective from the beginning was not anything more. There were some of us who thought that our objective should be to strangle Saddam Hussein. And we had a slightly different method to achieve that objective, but that was the objective. So now that the president has achieved his objective, the question is, what are the next steps? What can he do? What should he do about what's happening in Kurdistan, which is a kind of genocide? And to fully understand that, you have to know that in addition to the overt narrowness of objectives, there was a kind of encouraging, perhaps in a kind of clandestine way, the revolt in Kurdistan by the Kurds. And I think that it is not appropriate to have an overt policy that says one thing and a covert policy that apparently was saying something else. Because once you do that, you're sending mixed messages. So right now, the only way that the president could change circumstances in Kurdistan would be to invade and occupy the country, which I don't think is an appropriate option. The other would be for essentially to allow the country to be dismembered, with Turkey taking the northern part and Iran taking the eastern part. And frankly, I don't think that is a good option. So the range of things that he could legitimately do pursuant to his own objectives, notwithstanding the conflict between covert and overt, would, I think, imply refugee assistance and an attempt to try to help people in distress, but not direct military intervention. Now, if we can get that one to TV news, you're pretty right.
Senator, do you support the list of the Defense Department military base closures and realignments? And what would you say to people in areas where this is affecting a great number of jobs?
Well, no, I don't support all of the base closing decisions made by the Department of Defense. I mean, one of those is in New Jersey, Fort Dix, another is affecting New Jersey, which is the Philadelphia Naval Yard. I believe that base closure decisions are a necessary part of an environment in which you're cutting defense expenditures. I think we have to eliminate certain weapon systems, B-1, B-2 bomber, for example, the MX missile, but I also believe we'll have to cut back on bases. Now, the question is, what do the facts say? And I believe that the facts will reveal that some of the recommendations made by the Department of Defense have been incorrect. And I have met with the Secretary of Army on Dix, showed him new facts. He said he would consider them. Apparently he has not, and now I'm depending on the chairman of the Base Closing Commission, who is a former congressman from New Jersey, who does know the base closing facts related to Dix. So my answer is, I'm pleased about some things, I'm not pleased about other things.
When you make the comment incorrect, is that another way of saying it's a political move?
What, the base
closing?
I think it's pretty tough to make that case. I mean, I think there are 19 closures in Democratic areas and about 15 in Republican. I was more concerned about more closures being in the north, upper Midwest than in the south. I don't see a pattern here which would indicate that there are partisan reasons for the decisions. I think that in some cases they just haven't confronted what the real facts are.
I have a follow-up on that. In efforts in the next 3 to 4 years to reevaluate military bases and possibly cut defense spending more, do you foresee more base foreclosures or closures or realignments?
Yes, I do. I think that will be a part of our budget scene for at least the next 5 to 6 years.
Do we have a last question?
Well, thank you very much.
I'm trying to turn the pump. Yeah.